Pie is comfort. Pie builds community. Pie heals. Pie can change the world. I know this sounds like a lofty statement, but I promise you it's true, and I hope by the end of my talk tonight you'll agree with me, and that you'll be inspired to not only make pie, but to share it with somebody else. Why pie? What's so special about pie? Well, for starters, I was born because of pie. I'm living proof of pie's seductive powers. My mother, when she was dating my dad, these are my parents, she knew that my dad loved banana cream pie, so she invited him over for a romantic supper of tuna casserole and Jell-O salad, and she made him a homemade banana cream pie. And he wasn't even through the first slice yet when he proposed to her. They've been married for 54 years, and she still makes him banana cream pie. I didn't learn how to make pie from my mother or from my Midwestern grandmothers. I learned how to make pie when I was 17. I was on a bicycle trip down the west coast of the US. I was in Washington State, and I was on the Olympic Peninsula, where they have lots of apple orchards, and came across an orchard that was full of ripe fruit. And we were just hungry kids on bikes, and so we thought we would stop and help ourselves to a few apples, so that nobody would miss a few. And sure enough, some old guy comes storming out of his house on the property and says, "What are you doing stealing my apples?" And then he realized we were just innocent kids. And it turns out he was a retired pastry chef. So he invited us into his house and taught me how to make my first apple pie. I went on to make a lot of pies after that. I employed my mother's wily methodology, trying to lure a husband. So it took many years and many pies, but I eventually did meet the man that I would marry. In 1999 to 2001, I went to San Francisco, and I was a web producer at a .com. Now, ironically, it was an outdoor adventure website, and the mandate, however, was to get people to spend more time on their computers. Not as much time outside, no. We want people to actually think that they're on the sailboat and can feel the spray on their face. We want people to actually think they're on the rock wall and they could feel the granite under their fingertips. And I thought this just made no sense to me. I was an outdoor adventurer myself. And besides, I was spending 16 hours a day in front of my computer, so I wasn't having the best time. I was making lots of money, but it was a burnout job for sure. And I finally got up the courage to quit. And in my exit interview, I said to my bosses, "I just want to go work with my hands. I want a tactile experience. I want to engage my senses. I want to go make pie." And I just blurted it out, not thinking that it was a real true statement, but that's what I ended up doing. I moved back to Los Angeles, and I went to Malibu, and there was a new gourmet takeout place there, and they were supposed to be known for their great pie. But I went in there to try some, and they didn't have any. And so I said, "Well, how come you don't have any pie?" And they said, "We're too busy to make it." And I said, another one of those blurt out throwaway statements, "Well, I'll make it for you." And they said, "What are your qualifications?" And I said, "Well, I'm from Iowa." And I got hired, and I spent the next 1 year baking pie by the sea. And it did exactly what I needed it to do. It restored my spirit. I was engaging my senses for sure. I was, smelling all that cinnamon, peeling all these apples, and it's a wonderful experience, that meditative process of sitting down and peeling apple after apple. And I was definitely feeling things very real, because I had lots of oven burns on my arms, so that put me right back into reality. But I was happy. I was making minimum wage, but I was making pie. And the people who bought my pies were also happy about that. But I ran out of money. You can't live off minimum wage in Malibu, California, trust me. So I took another .com job. I moved up to Seattle and worked at Microsoft for a couple of years. And it was during this time that I had a bicontinental relationship, a courtship, with Marcus. Marcus was a smart, sexy automotive engineer. He was from Germany. I went over to visit him in Stuttgart, and the first time I went over there, I took him a pie, and I had made an apple pie, and I took the extra time to weave the latticed crust so that it looked extra special. And I'm pretty sure that that pie helped seal the deal of that marriage proposal, because he treated that pie like it was a supermodel, posing it on the red carpet, as actually on the coffee table, and made sure that he took a lot of pictures of it before we could cut into it. Marcus and I were married 6 years, and then in August of 2009, he died unexpectedly and suddenly of a ruptured aorta. He was 43. Marcus was dead. I was devastated. And after the grieving and the crying and the grief counseling, I turned back to the thing that restored my spirit once before, and that was pie. I didn't go back and get a job at a pie shop. This time, it just started off with a couple of pies. A friend asked me if I would bring pies to her Thanksgiving dinner, and I, of course, said yes. And when I got back into my kitchen and I put my hands in the flour and rubbed the butter and the shortening between my hands and crimped my crust and saw the creativity of that experience and felt the therapeutic value of that experience, I thought, yeah, I'm going to be okay. I was making something for somebody else to share, and that felt good. And that was just a start. 5 months after Marcus died, I drove the RV that Marcus and I got together. I drove it from Portland, Oregon to Los Angeles. And I ran into a friend of a friend, and she was a TV producer. And she said, let's make a pie documentary. And I didn't have anything else going on in my life. I was mired in grief, and I just really wasn't functioning. So this gave me a great purpose and something to focus on. And she said, as part of this documentary, let's make 50 pies and hand them out on the streets of Los Angeles by the slice. That's 400 slices of pie. And I thought, all right, So we gathered 5 of my closest friends, and we spent an entire day baking, making our dough by hand, rolling all the crust, crimping, salt, cinnamon, sugar, flour, the whole kitchen was a mess, and it smelled so good. And we ended up with 50 pies. And we loaded up the RV, and then the next day we went down to Venice Beach. This is Abbot Kinney Boulevard in Venice, if anyone's familiar. And I thought, oh, gosh, maybe people aren't going to want pie. Maybe they're going to think, well, we're not supposed to take food from strangers, and hey, what'd you put in that pie? And the reaction was the opposite. People stopped and they said, oh, wow, that looks good. And then they would take a bite and they'd say, oh, that looks like my grandmother. It tastes just like my grandmother's pie. So they were happy and smiling. And then the next question was always, wait a minute, who's paying you to do this? Who's sponsoring you? And we said, nobody. We're just doing this to make the world a better place. And then they would say, yeah, that makes me want to do something nice for somebody else. So that was a very powerful experience in and of itself. But what I really took away from that day was that here I was at the lowest point in my life, and I still had something left to give, that I could give of myself and bring some happiness to other people, and that in turn made me feel better. I had a similar experience, not exactly the same, but a year ago, December 18th, the tragic day of the Newtown, Connecticut shooting, I was sitting at my house in rural Iowa and listening to the news, and I was just growing increasingly depressed and frustrated as the day wore on, as the news kept coming out. It was so awful and so sad. And in a moment of desperation, I posted something on my Facebook page. I just said, God, if it would help those people in Newtown to make pie for them, I would load up my pie baking supplies right now and get in my RV and start driving. And within seconds, I had people commenting on my post saying, I'll help you drive. I'll pitch in for gas. And so 2 hours later, I was packing up the RV and hitting the road. And Janice, the woman who I made the pie documentary with, she lives in Flanders, New Jersey. And so she chimed in and said, you can use my house to make the pies. So by the time we drove to New Jersey, Janice had not only gotten her house organized for pie baking, she had the whole block employed. So there were like 8 ovens all the way down the street. They all had pies in the ovens. And word had gotten out that we wanted to do something to help with the Newtown tragedy. And so people wanted to help also. They were just like me, wanting to be able to help, but not knowing quite what to do. So they would drive from as far as 4 hours away to this house in New Jersey to help peel apples and roll dough. And this was the holiday season too. People gave up a lot of their time just to come here and do something for Newtown. And just this day alone, these couple of days actually, would have been enough to restore the faith in humanity after that tragedy. By the time we were done, we had over 60 volunteers, and we had made 240 pies. And we loaded those pies into the RV and drove to Newtown. And again, I wasn't quite sure how we would be received once we got there. Would these people say, hey, you're invading our privacy or what? But it turned out, again, to be a more positive experience than I could have ever dreamed. What happened was people would come by our table and they would see the pie and they would stop and have a slice, and maybe they would run into a neighbor and they would partake in this conversation. And what we had done inadvertently is created a gathering place for people to come together. And we weren't just nourishing their bellies, we were nourishing their souls. And it was just a beautiful thing to see. It wasn't a magic pill, but this little bit of pie was just a momentary distraction, at least, from the pain, and people were still able to smile through their tears. But you don't have to make 50 pies or 250 pies to make a difference in the world. One pie can have an impact. This is my sister. She was very excited about the pie I made for her as a just welcome to my house, no special occasion. But I had a great experience, well, I wouldn't call it great, but it was an impactful experience when I quit the pie baking job in Malibu, and I had to break my lease. And my landlord was not happy with me. He was very angry, and I think he was an angry person in general, but he wasn't happy about me breaking the lease. And I felt really bad about it, and I thought, well, what can I do to ease the tension? So I baked him a peach crumble pie. And I thought, well, rise above it and do something nice for this guy. So he didn't say thank you or anything. But a couple days later, I ran into him in the driveway, and he rolled down the window, his rusty Porsche, and he said, thanks for the pie, it was good. So I like to think that pie, at least got through a little bit of that hard shell. Who knows what was happening in this guy's life that he might have felt so unloved. But really, with this kind of effect and impact, pie should be served on Capitol Hill and at G8 meetings and Middle East peace talks. And really, pie knows no political boundaries or nationalities. It makes people of all races happy. I was in South Africa 2 years ago, and I taught pie making at a South African township. I thought, oh gosh, these kids aren't going to know what American apple pie is, and they're not going to care. But here they were, completely enthusiastic, just ready to dive into the bowls of flour, which they did. There was flour everywhere. And they were so engaged in the process, so attentive and so appreciative. And they waited impatiently by the oven door for those pies to finish baking. And then they couldn't wait to take their pies home to their families and share them. And these were kids who lived in shacks with no electricity or plumbing, and yet they were so full of joy and gratitude. And then I went to Tokyo, Japan, and taught pie making, and I learned pie knows no language barrier. These people didn't speak English, but here we were, the universal language of pie dough. In this case, we were using rice flour, local ingredients, and it was just really fun to see how these business people set aside their rigid business demeanor, and as soon as they got their hands in the dough and started peeling those apples, they just started smiling and laughing and interacting with one another. And once again, they couldn't wait to take their pie home and share it with their colleagues and their friends of, look what I made, So again, no English even spoken. But pie doesn't have to be perfect to be appreciated. I made this, by the way. It was 110 degrees in the kitchen that day, and I did salvage it. It's just the bottom. Nobody could see the disaster that it was. But we live in such a complicated world these days. It's high tech, it's high, fast pace, and there's just such great value at getting back to the basics, just not worrying about the recipe, not worrying about the perfection. Really, what matters is that invisible ingredient of the human touch, that you put your love into that pie and your personality and your signature on it, and you put your heart and your soul into that pie. Because really, right, if everybody would just make pie, would take the time to show that they cared and take the time to just to have that tactile experience, to put the human touch in it, if people would just make each other pie and share that pie, the world really would be a better place. Thank you.